What if the next phone call from the Oval Office decides who lives and who doesn't? What if that call has already been made, and nobody outside a few rooms in Washington knows it yet? Before we go further, do one thing for me. Hit that like button right now, not at the end. Right now, because YouTube shows this video to more people the second you do it, and the story you're about to hear needs to reach them too. Subscribe if you haven't, turn on notifications, and send this to one person who still thinks this war is almost over. It isn't. Here's where things actually stand tonight. The United States and Iran are not edging toward conflict. They are already deep inside one, and it is getting worse by the week. This war did not start yesterday. It started back in late February, when the American president announced what he called major combat operations against Iran, a joint campaign with Israel that hit military sites, government buildings, and infrastructure across the country. For a while, there was hope. In June, American and Iranian negotiators sat down and signed a memorandum of understanding, a kind of roadmap toward ending the fighting. People exhaled. Cable news moved on to other stories. Shipping companies quietly hoped the Strait of Hormuz would go back to normal. Then it fell apart. Less than a month after that agreement was signed, the president declared it over. On July 10th, he formally told Congress that fighting with Iran had resumed, and it did not resume quietly. Within days, American strikes were hitting Iranian targets almost every single night. Command centers, coastal surveillance posts, missile and drone launch sites, communication networks. Night after night, the same pattern repeated itself, a wave of strikes, a statement from Central Command, and a promise that more was coming. Iran did not sit still either. Over one brutal weekend, Iranian strikes killed American service members stationed in Jordan. Reports at the time described 2 killed and 1 missing, and within days, that number climbed higher as more incidents were confirmed. A service member in Iraq died during what should have been a routine deployment. By the time you add it all up, multiple American troops have now died in a war that Congress never formally voted to authorize. Not one, not 2 people arguing on cable news. Real families getting real visits from uniformed officers at their front door. The president responded exactly the way you would expect. He said publicly that Tehran would pay for the deaths of American troops. Within hours, U.S. Central Command confirmed another round of strikes. Iranian state media reported explosions in multiple cities. This is not posturing anymore. This is a war measured in nights, not headlines. And the nights keep adding up. By the middle of July, U.S. Central Command confirmed this had become the 9th consecutive night of strikes. Officials were blunt about the goal, continued degrading Iran's ability to threaten commercial ships and civilian sailors moving through the Strait of Hormuz. That single stretch of water is one of the most important shipping lanes on the planet. Before this war reignited, roughly 130 vessels passed through it every single day, carrying oil that keeps much of the global economy running. Now, on some days, fewer than 10 ships make the crossing. Tankers are sitting still. Insurance costs are exploding. Oil prices have pushed past $100 a barrel for the first time in years. And every person filling up their car anywhere in the world is quietly paying a small tax on a war most of them haven't even noticed is happening. Iran's Revolutionary Guard has leaned hard into this pressure point. Reports describe mines detonating near tankers, fires breaking out on vessels in the Gulf of Oman, and Iranian forces describing the strait itself as unsafe and effectively closed to shipping. An Indian sailor working as a ship's engineer was confirmed dead after his vessel was struck near that same stretch of water. This is not an abstract geopolitical argument anymore. It is showing up in body counts on both sides. So here is where the tension really sits. Iran claims it has caused significant damage to American forces and vessels every time it retaliates. The United States claims it is systematically dismantling Iran's ability to fight back, hitting command centers, radar stations, missile depots, and drone sites almost nightly. Both sides are publicly confident. Both sides cannot be right. And the gap between those 2 claims is exactly the space where the next explosive headline is going to come from. Meanwhile, in Washington, something remarkable happened this week. Something that tells you far more about where this war is heading than any single airstrike could. On the very same day, the House of Representatives and the Senate voted on measures designed to end American involvement in this war. And they landed in 2 completely different places. The House passed its resolution 214 to 208, a narrow but real majority calling for U.S. forces to be pulled out of hostilities with Iran. It was the second time in this war that the House has passed something like this. A small handful of Republicans crossed party lines to join Democrats, a sign that frustration with this war is no longer confined to one side of the aisle. But that resolution is symbolic. It carries no legal force. It cannot stop a single bomber from taking off. The Senate tried something with actual teeth, a binding resolution that would have forced an end to hostilities. It needed to clear the floor. It fell just short, losing 49 to 47. 2 votes. That's the entire margin standing between where we are now and a legally mandated withdrawal. 2 votes in a chamber where senators from the president's own party are starting to publicly question a war with no clear finish. Line and a rising body count. Here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Even if both chambers had passed a binding resolution, the president would almost certainly have vetoed it. And overriding a veto requires a level of political unity that simply does not exist in Washington right now. So functionally, nothing currently stands between this administration and further escalation. No legal wall, no congressional veto, just political pressure that is rising, but rising slowly while the war itself accelerates night after night. Before we go deeper into what this actually means for the weeks ahead, pause for 1 second. If this is the first time you're hearing how far this conflict has already gone, that alone tells you something about how this story is being covered. Smash that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next, because the version of this war that shows up in most feeds is not the full picture. And we're about to get into the part almost nobody is talking about clearly. Let's talk about why this war restarted in the first place, because that answer explains almost everything happening right now. Back in June of last year, American and Israeli strikes hit Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities. At the time, the administration described the damage in the strongest possible terms, saying those sites had been completely and totally destroyed. A Pentagon assessment conducted a month later told a more complicated story. That internal review concluded Iran's nuclear program had likely been set back by roughly 2 years. Not eliminated, delayed. 2 years. Sounds like a long time until you remember how fast enrichment programs can restart once the immediate damage is cleared and equipment is rebuilt. That gap between the public claim and the private assessment matters enormously because it shapes the entire argument happening in Washington today. Supporters of continued strikes argue that a 2-year delay is not good enough, that Iran cannot be allowed any runway at all toward a weapon, and that sustained pressure is the only way to keep pushing that timeline back further. Critics argue the opposite, that a war launched to prevent a nuclear weapon has now expanded into a broader campaign against Iran's military and economy, with no clear definition of what victory actually looks like or when American troops come home. Both sides are arguing from the same starting fact. They just disagree on what it means for how much longer this should continue. Now overlay the financial pressure. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a shipping lane to Iran's government. It is one of its most reliable sources of leverage and income, informally and formally. When traffic through that strait collapses from roughly 130 ships a day down to single digits, that is not just a headline about global oil prices. That is a direct hit to the revenue streams the Iranian regime depends on to fund its military operations, its proxy networks, and its own internal stability. Every night that American strikes target coastal surveillance sites and fast attack boats, they are not just degrading military hardware, they are squeezing an economic lifeline that Tehran cannot easily replace. This is why analysts increasingly describe Iran's recent actions, especially the attacks on commercial shipping, as a sign of pressure rather than confidence. A regime with room to maneuver does not usually risk sinking or damaging civilian vessels and killing foreign sailors. That kind of move invites international condemnation and gives Washington even more justification to keep striking. It is the behavior of a government trying to reassert control over a critical waterway, because that control is slipping through its fingers, not the behavior of a government comfortably in charge of the situation. At the same time, this war is not happening in isolation. It sits inside a much bigger, much colder calculation about where American military attention and resources are spread across the globe. Every dollar, every aircraft, every unit committed to operations against Iran is a dollar, an aircraft, and a unit that is not available somewhere else. Analysts who study great power competition point out plainly that a prolonged Middle East conflict pulls American focus away from other regions where rival powers would very much like Washington distracted. That does not mean every escalation in this war is secretly orchestrated by some outside actor. It means the longer this war drags on, the more convenient that becomes for anyone who benefits from American attention being split. And here's the piece that ties it all together with brutal simplicity. This war is now stretching past the 145-day mark since strikes resumed in February, and it is doing so just months before American midterm elections. That timing changes everything about how this plays politically. A war without a clear end date, killing American troops in a region most voters cannot immediately locate on a map, is exactly the kind of story that becomes a defining issue at the ballot box. Republican leadership knows this. It is part of why some members are breaking ranks to support resolutions calling for withdrawal, not necessarily because they have changed their view on Iran, but because they are reading the political room, and the room is getting uncomfortable. So you have 3 clocks, all ticking at different speeds inside the exact same war. The military clock, measured in consecutive nights of strikes and rising casualty counts on both sides. The economic clock, measured in oil prices, shipping traffic, and a regime's shrinking room to maneuver financially. And the political clock in Washington, measured in vote margins that are getting closer every single time this comes up for a vote. 2 votes short in the Senate this week. Watch that number closely, because if it ever flips, everything about how this war can legally continue changes overnight. If you're starting to see how these pieces connect, that's exactly the point of putting this together instead of just scrolling past another headline. If this video is helping that click into place, do me a favor and share it with someone who still thinks this is a simple story with a simple ending. It isn't, and the next section explains exactly why. Let's talk about what actually happens if none of these clocks change course, because that is the scenario almost nobody wants to say out loud. Picture the pattern that has already been running for months. American aircraft strike a target. Iranian forces retaliate, sometimes against troops directly, sometimes against ships passing through the strait, sometimes against regional bases tied to American interests. American officials respond publicly, promising Tehran will pay a price. Another wave of strikes follows. Within days, the cycle repeats. Each time it repeats, the casualty numbers on both sides tick upward. Oil prices absorb another shock, and the shipping companies moving through the Gulf recalculate whether the risk is even worth it anymore. This is not a war building toward a single dramatic climax. It is a war that has learned how to sustain itself night after night without needing a single defining moment to keep going. That sustainability is exactly what should concern people more than any single headline. Wars that build toward one decisive battle eventually resolve, one way or another. Wars that settle into a repeating nightly rhythm can continue for years, quietly reshaping economies, political careers, and thousands of individual lives without ever producing the kind of singular event that forces the world to fully reckon with what's happening. 9 consecutive nights becomes 13. 13 becomes 20. Somewhere in that stretch, the war stops being breaking news and starts being background noise, even while people keep dying inside it. Here's the uncomfortable truth underneath all of it. Iran's entire strategy right now appears to be built around outlasting American political patience rather than defeating American military capability. That is not a new playbook. Regimes facing prolonged pressure from a much stronger military power have used this approach before, absorb the damage, avoid the kind of provocation that would justify total escalation, and wait for the other side's own internal politics to force a withdrawal before the conflict reaches its own natural conclusion. It is a strategy built on patience, not power. And it has worked for other governments in other decades. But the conditions this time are genuinely different in a few important ways. The financial pressure on Iran through the collapse of Hormuz shipping traffic is severe and largely outside its ability to fully reverse while American forces remain positioned to strike coastal and maritime targets. The political pressure in Washington, while real, has not yet reached a level where it can legally force a withdrawal, and a presidential veto remains a near certainty if it ever does. And the midterms, sitting just months away, mean that whichever party appears to be losing control of this narrative faces genuine electoral consequences, which tends to accelerate decision-making rather than slow it down. Put those 3 factors together, and the honest, unglamorous conclusion is this: neither side currently has a clean, obvious path to a decisive win, and neither side currently has a clean, obvious reason to stop. That is precisely the kind of situation that produces long, grinding conflicts rather than short, dramatic ones. Not because anyone particularly wants that outcome, but because the alternative, backing down first, carries a political and strategic cost that neither Washington nor Tehran appears willing to absorb right now. There is one more layer worth sitting with before we get to where this actually leaves us. Wars like this rarely end because one side achieves total victory. They end because the cost of continuing eventually exceeds the cost of stopping, for one side, or more often, for both at roughly the same time. Right now, based on everything we've walked through, Iran's costs are rising fastest on the economic and military side. America's costs are rising fastest on the political side, service member deaths mounting, congressional patience thinning, an election calendar approaching. Whichever cost curve bends first is likely to determine who blinks, and right now, it is genuinely too close to call. That uncertainty is exactly why this story deserves more attention than it's getting. And if you've made it this far, you already understand more about what's actually happening than most people scrolling past headlines today. Drop a comment below telling me which of those 3 clocks you think moves first, the military one, the economic one, or the political one, because I read every single one, and the perspective from people actually paying attention matters more here than another talking head on cable news. So where does this actually leave us tonight? A war that restarted because a fragile agreement collapsed in under a month. American troops who have died in a conflict Congress never formally authorized. a shipping lane responsible for a massive share of the world's oil quietly grinding to a near halt, with the financial pain spreading far beyond the Middle East into every gas station and grocery bill on the planet. A Congress split almost exactly down the middle, 2 votes away in the Senate from a binding demand to end this, and still unable to actually force the president's hand even if it got there. And a president who has shown again and again that when American forces take losses, the response is more strikes, not fewer. None of this is destined to end quietly. None of it is destined to end soon. What we do know from the pattern of the last several months is that both governments are currently betting on the other side, running out of patience first. Iran is betting that American political exhaustion and a shrinking congressional appetite for endless war will eventually force a withdrawal before its own economy and military infrastructure buckle completely. Washington is betting that sustained pressure on Iran's finances and military capability will force Tehran back to the negotiating table with far less leverage than it had back in June, when that now-collapsed agreement was first signed. Somewhere between those 2 bets sits the actual future of this war, and neither government controls the timeline alone. Every night of strikes adds pressure to Iran's side of the ledger. Every American casualty adds pressure to Washington's side. Every barrel of oil crossing $100 adds pressure to the entire global economy watching from the sidelines. This is not a war being decided by a single decision in a single room anymore, if it ever was. It is being decided by which side's pressure becomes unbearable first. And that is a question nobody, not the analysts, not the generals, not the senators casting these razor-thin votes, can answer with any real certainty right now. What we can say, plainly, is this. The version of this conflict that most people think they understand, a brief flare-up that already ended months ago, does not exist anymore. It never really did. What exists is a war entering its 5th month with no legislative break, no clear finish line, and 2 governments each convinced the other will break first. History does not have a great track record with conflicts built on that exact assumption. Sometimes both sides are wrong. Sometimes the cost climbs far higher than either government expected before anyone actually blinks. If tonight's breakdown gave you a clearer picture of where this war genuinely stands, that is exactly why this channel exists, to cut through the noise and lay out what's real without the spin from either side. Hit subscribe if you haven't already, keep that notification bell on, and share this with someone who needs to understand that this war never actually stopped. It just stopped making headlines for a while. We'll be back the moment either those votes or either those clocks moves again. And given everything you just heard, that moment may come far sooner than anyone in Washington wants to admit.